agriculture.
What we do here is go back.
Before the Neolithic Revolution, the only major source of food was through hunting and gathering groups, where men and women were divided among the work to gather local fruits and flora, and the men would hunt and protect their nomadic groups. However, with the dispersion of major technologies through nomadic pastoralism, climatic shifts, and perhaps the accidental dropping of seeds, the Neolithic Revolution was born.
The Neolithic Revolution caused a social class system that allowed for people to focus on more than just getting food. New specializations were created, such as artisans and blacksmiths, as a result of the creation of sedentary societies and a need for larger yields of crops for exponentially growing civilizations.
The Neolithic Revolution spread and developed. New regions around major water sources would become the foundations of civilization and agriculture. Mesopotamia would become Samaria, the Indus River Valley became Harappa, the Nile would become the home of the Egyptians, and the Yellow River would become the Shang dynasty. In these early civilizations, the social structure was less complex and heavily dependent on who had control over the most food. Large farm owners would employ peasants to work their land, and in exchange, the peasants would be offered protection.
Agricultures in the classical empires evolved into more of a hierarchy system that involved the rulers controlling the peasants and therefore the food production. As a result, peasants made less money than the higher class, who controlled the production and the distribution of food throughout the empire. This created a dynamic in which the upper class, having a lower population than the lower class, were able to control the majority of the peasants.
After the decline of the classical empires, many peasants felt unsafe from attacks from outlaws and nomadic invaders. This led to a large amount of peasants clustering around powerful landlords who provided protection and security in exchange for the food that peasants provided in agriculture.
Manorialism was implemented in order to keep peasants under control in the form of serfs. This later evolved into feudalism, a complex system involving local lords who controlled peasants, offering protection in exchange for food. This system increased the power of knights and local lords, allowing them to become one of the most powerful social classes in Europe at this time.
The origins of Mesoamerican agriculture date back to the Archaic period, by which many hunter-gatherer nomadic groups began to deliberately cultivate local fauna and flora. Despite the cultivation of these crops, they were mainly used as a reserve food source early on, just in case a hunting season was bad or there was a drought. Three of the most important crops, however, were maize, squash, and beans. These crops were revered for their importance to survival in Mesoamerican society, for their easy transportation and high amount of nutrients they provided. Together, these crops were coined their three sisters and helped retain nutrients in the soil as if they were planted together. The importance of these crops were reflected in Mesopotamian art, rituals, and myths.
The Aztecs produced some of the most innovative agricultural techniques, especially for the time, with the environment of the marshlands which surrounded their empire lending itself to the development of chinampas, or artificial islands, creating to allow the marshland to be suitable for farming. Chinampas marks another innovation which represents a civilization adapting to their environment in order to make a suffice resource, similar to the terracing work produced by the Incas for farming on hillsides as well.
The Age of Imperialism introduced new forms of agriculture in the form of the Columbian Exchange. European civilizations sailed to distant lands such as the Americas and the Indian Ocean. This resulted in new trade routes and a need for new types of labor. The Europeans needed cheap and free labor in order to manage their new plantations. Europeans enslaved indigenous Americans and African people in order to create an unpaid labor force that could fund their colonies.
Europeans then sent unrefined natural resources and cash crops to the mother country and sold it for a much higher price. Additionally, the start of utilization of indigenous labor created new racial classes, such as Spanish intervention in the Americas, where racial classes were divided between European people and the indigenous Mexicans and other enslaved races. These new racial classes were granted different privileges and opportunities which were above the indigenous, but below the Spanish.
As As the expansion of maritime empires reigned in the Americas, new forms of forced labor were implemented throughout empires, such as indentured servitude, meta labor in the Spanish colonies, and slavery.
New labor forces that were a result of slavery often resulted in Creole social classes. These new social classes were denied certain rights based on their lineage. This eventually created a problem for the higher classes when Creoles rebelled against them. This is another case of lower class peasants having a direct impact on society through rebellion. This shows a continuity throughout the centuries of peasants, although low on the social hierarchy pyramid, actually controlling the welfare of an entire civilization.
The Second Agricultural Revolution, also known as the British Agricultural Revolution, was the rapid increase in agricultural labor and output due to innovations in farming. Norfolk crop rotation, the Chinese oxen plow, and land conversions were used by domestic British farmers that contributed to the growth of efficiency and output of agricultural production in Britain. This supported a higher British population and an increase in urban workers since they were no longer needed in the fields.
Agriculture during this time period was relying on new technology that was invented during the Industrial Revolution. New technology and the use of fossil fuels developed new methods of agricultural production. These innovations did not necessarily change the means of production, but automated them and more sped up the process. This allowed the cities to maintain a higher population than they were previously able to.
With competition from other industrial nations, Western nations expanded their products with materials from other various colonies native to their land, such as oil, rubber, sugar, etc. During this period, Africa was divided in between various Western powers in the Berlin Conference to establish colonial territories.
The second age of imperialism bred new technologies in medicine. Quinine allowed for Europeans to survive malaria and establish colonies in Africa, which increased the amount of food the mother countries produced.
Oh look, it's time for the open letter. That was a pesticide. The Green Revolution, also known as the Third Agricultural Revolution, greatly increased production across the world due to the implementation of new seeds, GMOs, pesticides, and fertilizers. However, this revolution caused many issues due to the amount of safety hazards caused by chemicals and plant hybrids. Superbugs and radiation diseases were spread throughout the world. While the Green Revolution did result in the increased population and lifespan of the world, it also led to the environmentalist movement, which mostly protest the use of pesticides and GMOs, along with the making movements to protect Earth's resources. This includes attempts to utilize alternative sources of energy, along with protests against acts of deforestation. You dead. Modern-day agriculture involves the use of techniques and technologies from the Green Revolution, but with more limits due to governments and activists. Many movements in the late 20th and 21st century resulted in a ban on many genetically modified organisms and pesticides that were seen as harmful towards not only humans, but also the environment. This allowed for a return to subsistence agriculture and a renewed interest in locally grown products.
In the future, it is likely that technology will allow for safer methods of production while keeping the efficiency and large production yields that are present today. This will allow for activists to be satisfied with these new technologies, as they will be less harmful to the environment and more.
The Green Revolution really killed him. Look, a tree's even growing out of his body. Whoa! Whoa, he's alive! This has been Crash Course Agriculture.